Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a subject today that kicks off with a really, truly audacious claim. We're talking about a theory coming out of Iran that's presented as nothing less than the key to humanity's salvation.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely not burying the lead, is it? I mean, any theory claiming to be the pathway to global salvation, well, that immediately makes you sit up and pay attention. It demands a pretty close look at its foundations.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're setting out to do in this deep dive. You, our listener, you've shared a whole collection of sources with us. Articles, research, even your own notes, all digging into the ideas of this Iranian thinker, Janaka.
Right.
So our mission today is really to act as your guides through all this material. We want to pull out the most crucial bits of information, the real nuggets of knowledge. We need to understand the core mechanics of his theory, get a handle on his views on big concepts like freedom, religion, property, the role of government.
And critically, explore what it all means in a broader sense, especially, within the specific context of Iran today, which is obviously highly relevant.
Exactly. And it's clear from the sources this isn't some abstract academic exercise happening in a quiet library somewhere.
No, definitely not. These ideas have clearly stirred things up. The materials even mention legal action being taken against critics.
Right. That detail about legal challenges really jumps out. It tells you the stakes are seen as pretty high, and this theory is, well, anything but uncontroversial.
For sure, it's got real-world friction.
Okay, so let's get started then. At its absolute heart, what is the fundamental starting point for Janatka's theory? Where does he begin building this whole framework that leads to such a grand claim?
Well, right at the very root, as it's presented in the sources we have, is his assertion that the entire structure, his whole theory, it's built on principles he considers axiomatic.
Axiomatic, okay, so meaning like self-evident truths, things he doesn't feel need proving.
Precisely. He calls them the principles of the subject. The idea is these aren't things up for debate or that might change over time, like scientific theories sometimes do. They're more like postulates in geometry. You accept them as the starting point, and everything else is supposed to flow logically from there.
Got it. So he's not arguing for these principles, he's arguing from them. They're the bedrock.
That's exactly it. And he specifically identifies these foundational, non-negotiable principles as being common across all the Abrahamic religions.
Ah, okay. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
Right. And he names the three core axioms: monotheism, prophethood, and resurrection.
Monotheism, belief in one God. Prophethood, the idea of divine messengers. Resurrection, belief in an afterlife and final judgment. Okay, yeah, those are central across the board.
They are. But here's where his approach gets pretty distinctive. He doesn't just see these as, articles of faith or religious beliefs. He sees them as the fundamental building blocks for a rigorous formal system.
A formal system.
Yes, he actually calls his framework a formal system. That specific term comes up repeatedly. His claim is that everything else in his theory, concepts like freedom, rights, how government should work, all of it, is derived step by step, logically, inevitably, from just those three initial axioms.
Wow. So like a mathematical proof almost. You start with the axioms and deduce everything else.
Exactly. He explicitly makes that comparison. It's like building a logical proof where each step follows necessarily from the one before it, all tracing back to monotheism, prophethood, and resurrection.
So in his view, these religious principles aren't just beliefs people hold. They're like the source code, the fundamental operating system for understanding reality itself.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. He's presenting them as the basis for an objective, universal, and fully derivable system for organizing society, understanding human existence. Not just one belief system among many possibilities.
Okay, I see. And this is how he gets to that huge claim about salvation.
Yeah, exactly. Because he frames his theory as this formal system derived axiomatically from these, in his view, universal Abrahamic principles. He then positions it as offering the definitive cure. The sources use that word, cure, and the necessary solution for all the deep-seated problems he sees in contemporary society.
So the implication is?
What?
That all our problems, economic, social, political, they stem from basically ignoring or misunderstanding this system.
That seems to be the core idea, that humanity's issues come from rejecting or failing to properly implement the principles embedded in this formal system, and therefore adopting it, implementing the structure derived from monotheism, prophethood, and resurrection. That's presented as the only way to actually solve these fundamental problems and achieve, true societal well-being. which he equates to a kind of salvation.
So it's not just about individual spiritual afterlife stuff. It's about fixing society now, based on this specific framework.
Precisely. He seems to view his system as providing the essential objective blueprint needed to correctly diagnose and fix the complex real-world issues that governments and other systems are currently struggling with and largely failing at, in his view.
And obviously, claiming that one specific religious philosophical system derived this way holds the unique key to fixing everything. I mean, that's going to be controversial, right?
Absolutely. It's inherently controversial. Any claim to exclusivity like that is bound to generate pushback from people starting from different philosophical viewpoints or different religious interpretations or none at all.
Yeah.
And the source material confirms it has stirred up significant debate, especially within Iran, given the implicit links to Shiism. And again, that mention of legal cases against critics, it just highlights that this isn't just abstract theoretical debate. It's contentious. It's got real stakes.
Definitely makes it clear these are ideas meant to have impact, meant to be disruptive, and they're meeting resistance. Okay, now let's dig into one of the most, well, fascinating aspects of this, I think, and maybe counterintuitive for some. It's the really intense connection Janaka draws between freedom and religion.
Yes, this is crucial.
He frames Abrahamic religions, and you have to assume implicitly, Shiism within the Iranian context, not just as belief systems, but as this formal system that's specifically designed to give us a stable understanding of core concepts, like freedom.
Right. And here's where it gets, as you said, really interesting. He basically claims that a stable, objective, truly effective concept of freedom, and this includes religious freedom, can only be reliably derived from this specific formal system, the one grounded in monotheism, prophethood, and resurrection.
Only from that system. So attempts to define freedom based on, say, secular humanism or Enlightenment reason, they just won't work, according to him.
That's his core argument. He explicitly rejects the idea that freedom is a concept that can be successfully defined or secured outside of this specific divine framework. For him, any attempt to build freedom on purely human foundations, reason alone, other systems, they're inherently unstable. They lack the necessary axiomatic foundation, so they're ultimately doomed to fail.
So, hang on. He's saying that without the God of the Abrahamic faiths and the structure that comes from those three axioms, you simply cannot have genuine, lasting freedom.
That is his very strong assertion, yes. He argues that any system trying to establish freedom without this divine foundation is, and this is a direct quote from the source material we have, a total failure.
Wow. The total failure. Okay, let's break that down. How does he connect these specific principles, monotheism, prophethood, resurrection, to freedom? Let's start with monotheism, or tawhid. How does belief in one God lead to freedom?
Okay, so he makes this really direct link, and for many it might seem surprising. He connects tawhid, the oneness and ultimate sovereignty of God, directly to the respect for property rights.
Property rights. How does that connection work?
The reasoning, as you piece it together from the source, seems to be this. Since God is the ultimate sole owner of everything, la ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, he owns everything, then any legitimate human ownership is derived from God. It's dependent on God's will, God's established order.
Okay.
So human property rights are kind of like a divine grant or maybe a reflection of God's ultimate ownership. Therefore, violating someone's property rights isn't just a social faux pas or a legal issue. It's fundamentally an act of disrespect, maybe even rebellion, against God's established divine reality and ownership structure.
Right.
And since he basically equates property rights with freedom, which we'll get into more detail on this divine grounding for property rights, becomes the absolute bedrock of freedom itself in his system.
Wow. Okay, grounding property rights and therefore freedom directly in God's ultimate ownership. That's a very specific theological and philosophical move. It's not how most people think about property.
Not at all. It's quite unique.
So how do the other two axioms fit in? Prophethood and resurrection. How do they connect to freedom?
Well, prophethood acts as the delivery mechanism, you could say, the conduit for the divine system.
The instructions.
Exactly. The principles derive from monotheism, including the ones that establish the basis for property rights and freedom. They're communicated to humanity through the prophets. The prophet's role is to guide people according to this divinely revealed formal system, giving the necessary instructions, the examples for how a truly free society based on these principles should actually function.
So God is the ultimate owner. The prophet delivers the user manual based on that ownership. And resurrection, what role does that play?
Resurrection brings in this crucial element of ultimate non-temporal accountability. It goes beyond just earthly consequences. The speaker actually uses a game theory example to illustrate this point. He says, in purely worldly interactions, especially if they're one-off deals or anonymous, people might be tempted to cheat, break agreements, act selfishly for immediate gain because there's no guarantee of long-term consequence within that interaction.
Makes sense.
But the certainty of resurrection, the knowledge that you will ultimately go to that world and answer to someone else, as the source puts it, for all your actions, including violating others' rights, that provides a powerful systemic incentive to actually stick to the principles of the formal system, even when no one on Earth is watching.
The ultimate oversight committee.
Pretty much. This ultimate accountability is meant to foster trust and encourage behavior that's consistent with the system's definition of freedom and property rights, because there are consequences beyond the immediate.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this right. Monotheism establishes the ultimate basis for rights and order through God's ownership. Prophethood delivers the blueprint, the instructions for that order. And resurrection provides the ultimate enforcement mechanism, ensuring people follow the blueprint through future accountability.
That's a great summary. It's a tightly integrated system where these theological concepts are literally the foundation for the entire social and individual structure he envisions.
And this integrated structure, he believes, is what makes it the only stable system for freedom.
That's his argument, and he contrasts it explicitly with secular philosophies. He states very clearly that without the God of Abrahamic religions, and he makes a point to distinguish this from abstract ideas like Spinoza's God, which he equates more with nature and sees as insufficient, a truly freedom-loving non-believer is basically an impossibility.
An impossibility, well.
Because, in his view, any system that isn't rooted in his specific axioms leaves the formal system a total failure when it comes to providing that stable, objective basis for freedom. It just can't hold up without that divine foundation.
That's a profound challenge, isn't it? To secular humanism, to Enlightenment ideals that usually ground freedom in things like inherent human dignity or reason. He's essentially saying, you think you have freedom without my specific understanding of God. You don't. Not really. Not in the way that can last.
That is the absolute core of his critique against alternative frameworks. He believes only his system, derived axiomatically in this way, provides the necessary, objective, immutable foundation for concepts like freedom and property rights. Anything else is built on sand, essentially.
This perspective really does fundamentally redefine where rights come from and what truly grounds them. It shifts the entire basis.
And building directly on that, the idea that property rights come from divine reality, Janatka presents this really quite radical perspective on ownership rights, and that, in turn, shapes his view on government structure and function. He doesn't just say property rights are, important for freedom or a component of it. He makes this incredibly explicit and, frankly, striking claim. The source quotes him, "Property rights are the same. It is freedom."
Property rights are freedom. Not just related, but the same thing.
Yeah.
That's a powerful equivalence. It means any infringement on property is, by definition, a direct attack on liberty itself.
Precisely. That's the unavoidable conclusion in his system. Respect for property rights isn't some policy choice you make or a desirable goal. It's a foundational principle derived directly from his formal system, rooted in monotheism. So any action that violates property rights is by definition an act against freedom. Full stop.
Given that extreme stance, it makes total sense why he'd be so critical of, well, most modern governments, wouldn't it? Since they almost all regulate property, tax income, and property extensively.
Oh, absolutely. His critique of government actions that he sees as violations of these fundamental property rights is incredibly sharp, uncompromising. For instance, mandatory taxation. He describes it as really hard for many people and ties it directly to the state monopoly on power and resources.
So he views taxes as inherently coercive, a violation of ownership, because they're taken without the explicit voluntary consent of the owner for that specific transaction. Is that the idea?
That certainly seems to be the logical extension of his principle that violations happen when things are done without consent or without its own price being agreed upon by the owner. But, he reserves perhaps his strongest language for government-induced inflation.
Ah, okay. What does he say about that?
He doesn't mince words at all. He calls it outright theft. The source quotes him saying, quite vividly, "The government can take this from me with inflation in my pocket. Take it, steal it."
Inflation as theft by the government. Wow, that's a highly provocative accusation. It paints monetary policy not as an economic tool, but as a direct act of stealing value right out of people's pockets.
Yes, he sees the state's exclusive control over currency, its ability to just print money. He sees that as a primary way. It violates property rights, causes economic harm, instability. It's all linked.
Okay, so if the standard activities of government taxing, printing money, regulating property are viewed as these fundamental violations of principles and freedom, why does he think a state is necessary at all? What is the legitimate role of government, if any, in his system?
Right. This is where his vision really diverges from, well, pretty much all conventional political theory. He argues that the necessity for a state, it only arises because society fails.
Well, how?
Specifically, he suggests the state becomes necessary only because individuals and society, when they're not fully implementing the principles of the formal system, they fail in their divine duties, particularly the duty to help the poor.
So, in his ideal world, if everyone followed the system perfectly, we wouldn't need a state, or at least much less of one.
That seems to be the implication. In his ideal framework, where individuals fully adhere to the system, the need for a state would be drastically reduced, maybe even vanish. The state isn't seen as a natural or ideal institution, but more like a patch, a workaround, a corrective mechanism that's only needed because of human shortcomings in following the divine principles.
Okay, that's a very different way of looking at the origin of the state. So if it is necessary in the real world due to these failings, what should it do? What's its function?
He advocates for a radical reimagining of its function. The ideal government, in his view, should not be an entity with inherent power or ownership. He even suggests the current concept of the state as a ruler could be equated with the devil.
The devil. Strong words.
Very. Instead, he envisions the government purely as an agent or a service provider.
An agent, like a contractor.
Yeah.
What would that actually look like? How would it work in practice?
He gives this example about stopping construction in a forest. In a typical system, the government steps in because it owns the forest, or it has regulatory authority from its sovereign power, right?
Yeah, usually.
In Janaka's ideal system, the government would only stop that construction because the people, the actual owners or stakeholders operating under the principles of the formal system have commissioned it. They've hired the government, essentially, to act on their behalf to perform that specific task.
So the authority isn't inherent in the state itself. It's delegated by the people who are acting based on the formal system's principles for specific jobs.
Exactly. The government is reduced from a sovereign power to a kind of hired hand, a contractor executing tasks mandated by the people, accountable to them. It's a service function, not a ruling one.
That's a fundamental shift.
It is, and he also briefly touches on alternative economic structures that would fit this model. He mentions things like free banking, no usury, no inflation, and specifically points to Mudaraba.
Mudaraba, that's an Islamic finance concept, right? Partnership.
Yes, exactly. It's a type of profit-sharing partnership where one party provides capital, the other provides expertise or labor, and they share the profits based on a pre-agreed ratio. Crucially, the capital provider typically bears the financial loss unless there's negligence. He seems to see this, or systems like it, as an optimal way to handle economic activity and investment without relying on state currency monopolies or inflationary practices like printing money.
So it all connects. His view of property rights from God dictates his view of government as just an agent, which then points towards specific non-state-controlled economic models like Mudaraba. It's a whole integrated package.
A comprehensive blueprint, really, for restructuring society from the ground up, all based on deriving everything from those initial axioms.
And it's important to stress this isn't just abstract theorizing for him, is it? He directly applies this whole framework to the really pressing real-world issues that Iran is facing right now.
Absolutely. He presents these ideas not just as interesting philosophy, but as a practical solution for today's Iran. He believes this formal system can actually fix the concrete problems people are dealing with every day.
How so? What are some examples?
Well, he directly links his views on property rights and his critique of government ownership to major issues like poverty and homelessness in Iran.
Yeah.
He argues that the state owning huge amounts of barren land actually prevents people from doing what he calls homesteading, basically, occupying and developing unused land to provide for themselves.
Like opening up land for people to use productively.
Exactly. He contrasts this current situation where the state holds the land with what he claims were solutions available back in the Prophet's time. He suggests the poor then could find land and resources to sustain themselves. So, in his view, government land ownership isn't just inefficient, it's a fundamental barrier created by a faulty system that directly causes or worsens poverty.
That's a very direct, tangible link he's drawing between his abstract principle about government ownership and a huge social problem. What about other issues? Like, Iran has faced concerns about its population, demographics.
He addresses that too. But interestingly, he ties the solution not to government policies or incentives, but to the strength and structure of the family. He calls the family a spontaneous popular institution.
Spontaneous, meaning it arises naturally, not created by the state.
Yes. And within the family unit, guided by the principles of his formal system, he argues there's potential for, well, spontaneous order. And critically, respect for the individuality and freedom of children.
Freedom of children. How does that connect to population?
He posits that when children are seen not as the property of their parents, but as individuals whose freedom and development are respected within that family unit, they're more likely to flourish, to become creative, responsible, productive members of society. And this organic flourishing, he argues, naturally leads to demographic strength and growth. He contrasts this bottom-up approach, rooted in individual freedom within the family, with what he sees as the ineffectiveness of top-down government mandates trying to force population increase.
So again, it's about decentralized, spontaneous order based on fundamental principles, rather than state control. The solution emerges naturally if the principles are followed.
That's the core idea. Locating the source of societal strength and health in these fundamental units and principles, not in state intervention. And he does the same for broader economic problems in Iran, things like inflation, lack of investment, difficulty compensating for losses. He ties all that directly back to the state's monopoly on creating currency and the resulting violation of property rights through inflation.
It really does consistently circle back to his main critique, the state infringing on property, which he says is freedom.
Exactly. And this entire framework leads him to this incredibly bold vision for Iran's potential future. He actually suggests that by fully adopting and implementing these principles, the principles of God's religion, understood as the only formal system stable for the concept of freedom, Iran could become, get this, the only and last bastion of freedom and civilization.
The only and last bastion. Wow, that is incredibly ambitious. Positioning Iran not just as, a regional player, but as the global standard bearer for freedom based on this specific religious framework.
It implies a potential total transformation of Iran based on his idea, becoming a model society for the entire world. And part of this involves another really contentious claim he makes, that much of accepted history, especially concerning prophets and imams, has actually been distorted over time.
Distorted history. So he's saying the historical record we have is wrong.
He seems to suggest that we need to return to the pure, undistorted formal system to correct these historical inaccuracies and reveal the true intended path for Iran's development, its governance, everything.
So applying his theory isn't just about changing policies for the future. It requires fundamentally re-evaluating and correcting our understanding of the past as well.
Yes, his system becomes the necessary lens, the key to unlock the true history and identify the errors in commonly accepted narratives. And finally, just to show how integrated it is, he brings in major religious events like Ashura.
The commemoration of Imam Hussein's martyrdom.
Right. He interprets the tragedy of Ashura as having two wings of freedom. And one of those wings, he says, includes the vital prohibition against the evil actions of oppressive rulers. He uses the term zahu. This interpretation obviously aligns perfectly with and reinforces his core critique of government overreach and the principle of resisting when the state violates the fundamental principles of the formal system.
So he's reinterpreting significant historical and religious touchstones to provide justification and examples for his core principles about freedom, property, and limited government. It all fits together in his view. Okay, shifting gears just a bit. Let's look at how he positions his theory philosophically and how it relates to some common political labels. He seems to have a very strong opposition to something he calls dialectics.
Oh, absolutely. He views dialectics, which he links to thinkers like Hegel, Marx, and even Spinoza in a particular way, as fundamentally flawed. He actually calls it a source of societal madness.
Madness, strong word again. And he thinks dialectics is the root of what exactly?
He argues it forms the intellectual foundation for what he broadly lumps together as collectivism.
Collectivism.
Okay.
And what specific ideologies does he put under that big umbrella?
He lists quite a few. Marxism, socialism, fascism, Nazism.
Right, the usual suspects often critiqued together, though very different.
Exactly. But notably, he also includes feminism in that same list.
Feminism.
Mm-hmm.
Alongside fascism and Nazism. That's a very controversial grouping. Why does he lump them all together like that? What's the common thread he sees?
The common thread for him seems to be this shared underlying reliance on dialectical thinking. He believes this mode of thought inevitably leads to prioritizing the collective, the group, the state, the historical force over the individual, and, crucially, violating fundamental individual rights in the process.
Okay, so what's his core problem with dialectics itself? Why does he think it leads to this madness and these ideologies?
His fundamental argument against it, especially when considering his own formal system, is that the core principles within his system, things like property rights, have no antithesis or synthesis.
Meaning?
Well, in dialectical thinking, you have a concept, the thesis. It meets its opposite, the antithesis. And their conflict or interaction leads to a new, combined, or evolved concept, the synthesis. He's arguing that his axioms, like property rights, just are. They're foundational truths. They shouldn't be subjected to this process of conflict, change, evolution, or negotiation between opposites.
So for him, property rights are absolute, unchanging, non-negotiable because they're axiomatic. Whereas dialectical thinking would imply they could be relative, contested, maybe redefined through social or historical processes.
Precisely. He sees trying to apply dialectical reasoning to these fundamental axiomatic principles as the very source of the intellectual and societal madness that gives rise to these collectivist ideologies. Because they emerge from dialectics, he believes they are inherently prone to undermining individual rights and freedom. They treat concepts like property as malleable or secondary to collective goals or historical stages rather than as fixed axioms.
And does this philosophical opposition, this rejection of dialectics and collectivism, explain how others perceive him or label him?
It seems to. He directly acknowledges being labeled far-right.
Okay.
And he explains that from his point of view, this label gets applied because his system represents this fundamental, axiomatic, undialectical alternative to what he sees as the dominant collectivist ideologies he's critiquing.
So, because his system is built on these unchanging axioms like property rights equals freedom, derived from monotheism, it stands in stark, irreconcilable opposition to ideologies that might prioritize group interests or historical forces or social constructs over these individual axiomatic rights, often using a dialectical framework to justify it.
That seems to be exactly how he frames it. It's not a label he necessarily embraces in a conventional political sense, but rather one he interprets as the reaction you'd expect from people embedded in a dialectical collectivist worldview when they encounter a system based on non-negotiable, undialectical axioms. It's like a fundamental clash of operating systems.
A clash of worldviews.
Yes. And just to round that off, he reinforces his preference for decentralized structures rooted in these principles. He briefly mentions his support for spontaneous popular institutions.
Like the family, which you talked about before.
Exactly. Institutions like the family, he sees them as examples of structures that, when they operate according to the principles of the formal system, naturally uphold things like property rights and individual freedom through organic interaction. This contrasts sharply with the often coercive nature of the centralized state, as he sees it.
Right. It's a consistent theme running through everything. Deep suspicion of centralized power, especially government, and a strong preference for decentralized, spontaneous order rooted in what he believes are immutable, divinely derived axioms. Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. To recap this deep dive, we've really dug into Janaka's complex and undeniably controversial theory. It starts with this idea of returning to foundational Abrahamic principles: monotheism, prophethood, resurrection.
Right, but not just seeing them as faith tenets, seeing them as the actual axioms of a formal system.
Exactly. A formal system that he claims offers the definitive cure, the solution for humanity's big problems. And he presents it very pointedly as a practical solution for today's Iran.
And we unpacked that really radical assertion at its core, that property rights are fundamentally the same thing as freedom, not just linked, but identical.
Yeah, a principle, he argues, comes directly from that first axiom, monotheism, and the idea of ultimate divine ownership.
Which then logically leads to his profound critique of standard government actions, doesn't it? Like mandatory taxation, like inflation. He doesn't just dislike them. He labels them fundamental violations of property rights, essentially theft.
Right. And instead, he pushes for this vision of the state being drastically reduced, cut down to just being an agent, a service provider that's explicitly commissioned by the people to do specific tasks, not a ruler.
And we saw how he applies all this theory to concrete, real-world issues in Iran, offering his framework as the answer to poverty, homelessness, the population crisis, economic instability, always by advocating for implementing his principles about property rights and decentralized spontaneous order.
And then there's the philosophical dimension, his very strong rejection of dialectics and all forms of what he calls collectivism, which he thinks lead to societal madness.
Yes, positioning his own axiomatic system as the only truly stable basis for freedom, which helps explain, from his perspective at least, why his ideas have led to him being labeled far-right by those operating from fundamentally different philosophical starting points.
He really claims his theory provides a uniquely strong theoretical foundation against other systems, even calling it a theoretical weapon in the battle of ideas.
It's a potent claim.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener, as you consider these ideas? I mean, this theory isn't presented as just some academic thought experiment. It's offered as a blueprint for a fundamentally different kind of society, one that, he suggests, could potentially redefine Iran's role entirely, making it this only and last bastion of freedom and civilization.
It really offers a complete integrated worldview. Everything derived from a specific set of religious axioms, claiming to provide not just objective truth, but also the necessary practical solutions for humanity's deepest, most persistent problems.
Which I think leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought for you to mull over. If, and it's a big if, but if, as Janatka claims, fundamental principles derived from one specific system are indeed the only key to solving humanity's complex problems and establishing true, stable freedom.
Yeah.
Well, how do we navigate that? How do we, as individuals, as societies, sort through all the competing claims about which system holds the correct principles? And maybe more importantly, on what basis do we ultimately decide? Who gets to make that determination?
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the very foundations of how we know things, how we structure society, and the criteria we use to judge what's true, what's effective, what's right. A lot to chew on there.